Okay, everybody, it's 11 a.m., so let's get started. Greetings from Purdue University, and welcome to EAB University's 2017 Fall Webinar Series, which is funded by the USDA Forest Service. This is Sarah Stack coming to you from Purdue University. Along with my EAB University colleagues Cliff Sadoff from Purdue, Robin Usborne from the Michigan State University, and Amy Stone from Ohio State University, we welcome you to today's webinar entitled After EAB, Encouraging a Healthy Forest. It's being presented by Kathy Smith, the Extension Program Director for Forestry in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. Kathy oversees OSU's Extension Private Woodland Owner Educational Program, the Ohio Woodland Stewards. She is co-leader with Jim Chatfield for the OSU signature program, Why Trees Matter, and serves on the program committee for the Gwynn Conservation Area. She has been with OSU Extension since 2001 and spent the previous 11 years of her career working as a watershed forester for the Ohio Division of Forestry. Before we get started, please know that we welcome your comments and questions, so please feel free to type them in the chat feature, which you can find by mousing over the bottom or occasionally the top of your screen. We will make a note of all questions, and we'll have Kathy respond to them when her presentation is finished. To keep these free webinars coming, we need your feedback. After the webinar, you will be emailed a link to a short, voluntary, and confidential survey that I hope you will take the time to fill out. If you're one of the first 10 people to fill out the survey, we will be sending you an EAB goodie bag. For those of you wanting CEUs, if you would like a certificate indicating that you participated in today's webinar, complete the survey and send an email message to Amy Stone at stone.91@osu.edu. You will also receive instructions in the email. Certificates will be mailed to you within a week of today's program. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing soon at www.emeraldashboard.info. You will also find the recordings for all previous EAB University webinars there. Thank you for attending today. And Kathy, please share your screen with your presentation and we will get started.
All right. Well, good morning. Hopefully everybody can see everything good, and we will get started here. We here in Ohio have definitely been dealing with Emerald Ash Borer, and I'm Woodland Owner. I'll state that right. We're going to talk a bit about my area today to try to put this in context for you as we look about what do we do after Emerald Ash Borer has kind of worked its way through your woodland. One of the places that we always need to start, and hopefully this is just a review for most of you, but why do you own your woodland? You know, what are you managing for? Why did you purchase it? What do you have it for? Why do you maintain it? Those are all kind of different questions, different ways of asking, you know, what's up? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? And this here you can see is from the Family Forest Owners of the United States survey that was done in 2006, with the yellow being the owners and the green being the area. And so you can kind of see as we look down through that list of their reasons for owning their woodlands, I think that a lot of times folks think, oh, there's, you know, timber has got to be right up there. Well, if you actually look, timber is pretty low on the list when you look at some of the other options there that folks have listed about why they own their woodland. But this is critical to kind of set that base standard. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish. You know, here's what I want to see happen on the ground. And we have to work with that standard kind of in the backs of our minds as we look at the woodland and how we work with it towards the future. So I'm going to pull out just a few of the objective goals that folks are looking at. And a lot of times when I was a field forester, folks would always say, oh, you know, wildlife management. Yeah, I want wildlife. What always matters, what species, because you're going to manage different for different species, or are you just trying to be a generalist? When we're talking recreation, are we looking at trails? Okay, so what kind of trails? Do you have horses? Are we talking hiking? Are we talking ATV? One of the ones I think that has picked up a lot in recent years is the photography side. A lot of folks enjoy going out and taking pictures, and I can contest to that. I'm one of those that loves to do it as well, but I also receive a lot of those photos from folks walks through their woods when they've seen something abnormal or something unique that they want to know more about. One of those other recreational items could be camping, and so when we think about camping, there's other things we have to think about, and the whole ash cycle can change that drastically, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here. And last but certainly not least is timber. As we said, a very small percentage identify timber as the reason that they own their woodland, but there's an awful lot of folks that still sell timber. In my own mind, while timber is on my list, it's not at the top of my list. And so we have to kind of try to work all of these together. And emerald ash borer came in and kind of changed the chart for some folks, I think. So why do you own your woodlands? Are you trying to manage for these guys? These few pictures that I've got here are from my place, where my lovely little squirrel here is just kind of eating off all the flowers on the pin oak tree. It's like, if you eat the flower, you don't get an acorn, guy. So, but are you managing for something like squirrels? Are you managing for something more like turkeys? Different needs for habitat for both of them, and we have to keep that in mind. As I said, photography. This is one I took from a place this past spring. A lot of folks are really starting to get into birds and, different photograph styles, what they're trying to capture with them, and so it's something else to keep in mind. Or are we looking at some other things that maybe we don't see as often as this fox would be? What are we trying to accomplish as we're looking at our goals and objectives? And I had to throw these guys in. Even though you probably aren't managing to attract them, you're going to have to manage for them, because they're going to manage your vegetation in some respect, depending on the population number. They can be cute in this stage, but they can also be devastating when we're looking at regeneration in a forest if you've got large numbers of them. So again, it has to be managed, and it has to be factored into the big picture as we move forward. Recreation trails. How serious are we about trails? Foot trails, hiking trails are a little easier to deal with than ATV, UTV type trails. Those type trails, we need to be a little more consistent with dealing with water issues and making certain we aren't eroding soil and causing other tree issues in the woods. And so again, still plays into what are we trying to accomplish and where are we trying to go. And last but not least, timber. Trees will grow whether you're managing them or not, but if timber is part of that goal that you have, that you want to be able to harvest some of that resource, then we need to think about species, and we need to think about quality, and trying to shorten the rotation so that you do see some benefit from your management. So we're going to start here with kind of of things, whether a woodland owner or just a manager, things that you're probably already doing, but I kind of wanted to put them down in context. The more we can be proactive, better than reactive, the better off we're going to be. A lot of times for these things, though, we end up reacting. In my case that we'll talk about in a little bit, I did try to be proactive, and so I think in the long run you'll here with the result, but sometimes we don't have an option. Become knowledgeable and stay current on your woodland issues. You're doing that today, here, other webinars, what you're reading, what other events you go to. Stay current. Understand what's going on kind of in the big picture, and know what your risk is, what's close, what should I be paying closer attention to. Your ownership and management objectives and goals, all of that plays in. You can't do one without the other. And so you need to kind of have a path that you're trying to follow, unless you really are going to be a hands-off person and just let nature take its course. I think this is the one that we aren't all great at. I can honestly say probably before emerald ash borer, I was not as good at this one as I should have been. But understand what's going on in the woods, know what you have. That way when something pops up on your radar that is a future potential impact, whoa, this one goes after these species and I have a lot of this species, now what do I need to do, kind of thing. There's a lot of management strategies out there, and so in order to have the best path possible forward, you're going to have to evaluate and select some things on what works for you. What works for you may not work for me, or it may not work for your neighbor. So be able to kind of look and evaluate and then implement what is appropriate for what you're dealing with. And as always, I can't reiterate it enough, there's a good group of professional forest land managers out there, whether it's your state's service forestry, whether it's a private consulting forester or somebody who is an industry forester. They want to help you manage your land and can provide that knowledge and that assistance to help you meet your goals and objectives. So with that, what do you have, depending on where you are in your infestation of emerald ash borer? When we inventory the woodland, did ash compose less than 20% of your stand? So as you looked at it, okay, 20, maybe 25% of my trees were ash. In my own cases, you'll see I had sections that were 60% ash. So if it was 20% or less, you're probably just looking that by losing that ash, you've done a thinning in the stand, and you may not have too many impacts. It may just open up the stand a little bit and allow the remaining trees to kind of take off and take advantage of that gap in the canopy. When ash was a greater percent, 25, 30, and up, we may have to do some manipulation and try to compensate for such a large loss on the landscape. What species do you have? And I include trees and shrubs, because if we go back to those management goals and you're managing for wildlife, shrubs play a huge role in that aspect. And so you want vertical diversity as well as species diversity. And so you need to know kind of both. And we'll talk about another reason why to kind of know the shrubs. And then, is there anything else going on in the woods? I mean, do you have some other noticeable insect and or disease issues? So here's one. If you've got dead ash in your woods, you've probably seen those lovely little marks on the bark of this dead ash where the woodpeckers have gone after the larvae. But in this case, we've got some fungi that have grown their bodies out of that D-shaped exit hole, which is kind of a unique feature I hadn't seen till just a few weeks ago. So here's something that might catch your eye. Ask the question, should I worry about this? Well, we know it's an ash, we know it's dead. This is something you need to take note of. You're not going to deal with the fungi, but you definitely have a tree that's in the advanced stages of decay once you see these fungi fruiting bodies on the outside of the tree. Here's something else. As you're walking through the woods and you see this issue, do I worry about this? Well, these are some mites that probably were working on this young ash seedling. Something to worry about? Not really. Something to take note of? Sure. It's something that's going on in the woods that you might just want to keep an eye on. And then here, set of mites working on these ash leaves. And yes, it could be working on any other species for both of these, the two mites. But in this case, both of these images that I had were for ash. But normal, trees still functioning, and nothing to really panic about. And you come up on something like this. And so what's the plant? Well, it's beech. Is this normal for beech? And the answer is no. This leaf obviously has, and if you could feel it, they are kind of hard ridges between the veins. And this is something that we're starting to see in Northeast Ohio. They have some in Northwest Pennsylvania and a few other spots that we're calling beech leaf disease. But we know very little about it, other than that this is happening, the leaves are misshapen. There are some folks that are connecting death of some seedlings, saplings, but we don't know that we can connect the two. There's a lot more to be explored here, but this would be something if you were walking through the woods, you know, you maybe need to look at this and ask somebody, is this something that I should be worried about? And then there's these. I've gotten lots of calls this year calls and emails about these lovely little guys. So these affectionately called the boogie aphid, because when you disturb them, they kind of dance around trying to scare you off. But they're normal. They're the beech blight aphid, and apparently in some parts of Ohio this year, they're very abundant because I've had numerous calls and emails. Something to worry about? No. They're normal. They're usually around, and lots of times you'll never even know they're there. But this year, apparently, they're much more prevalent, and so folks are asking questions, which is always a good thing. I'd rather have you ask and me be able to say, nope, this is normal, nothing to worry about. You may not see them at all next year, than to have you not ask, and who knows what that next stage might be. Another fungus issue, see it at the base of the trees, just like the ones we talked about on the ash tree. This is an indicator that this tree has some decay going on inside, and something that you need to think about for the life of the tree and how you're going to manage that tree. And another one, so what is the plant? Well, this is arrowwood viburnum. It does look like we've had some voracious insects feeding. Is it normal? No, because this is Viburnum beetle, and this is a non-native invasive pest that is starting to hit some of our native viburnums. And so if you're, again, I kind of go back to that, if I'm managing for wildlife, these species produce soft mass, which is part of that food source. And so I need to be aware that, hey, I've got some viburnum leaf beetle issues, and what do I need to do to try to compensate and keep viburnum as part of my stand. And we usually see these are horned oak galls. Something to worry about? Not really. If they fully engulf yes, they can kill a tree, but a lot of times they just look unsightly. Obviously on this one, it's just a small, kind of scraggly looking red oak sapling. Probably wasn't going to do well anyhow, and you can also see an old scar on there from cicada damage from last year. But something to note that you do have, and if you want to take the time, you can prune them out and work with the tree. This kind of stuff, forest floor, this lovely decaying log, provides a lot of habitat. So it's not something to worry about. It's a good thing to have, and just helps also as it decays to put nutrients back in the soils. This side by side, on the left, you can kind of see where the woodpeckers have really gone after that dead tree. Good habitat, worked very well, not something I really would worry about. But the one on the right is a young beech with a lot of kind of black looking nodules up and down the trunk. Not common, something to look at. In fact, we have some photos. We're going to have another look at this tree that we found on a site. Because you need to know, is it something that's going to spread to the other ones? Do I need to cut it out and destroy it? Is it just an odd phenomenon? So those are kind of things you need to think about as you're inventorying. After emerald ash borer is gone, what do you have left? What does it look like? What am I dealing with? And how many of these do you have? This is just a small smattering of some of the non-native invasive plants you may be dealing with depending on where you're located. You've got to be able to identify them, and we'll talk a little bit more about them, but they can be a huge issue as we work through and try to keep our forest healthy and growing. So I guess I'm going to throw my own scenario out here for folks to take a look at. We have a 120-acre farm here in Ohio. 80 acres of it is in woodland, as you can kind of see from the photo. As I said earlier, one section of the farm, which was this area down into here, was 60% ash. And so when I realized that after emerald ash borer was found in the state, I also realized that I was going to try to be proactive and get in there and do some things. A lot of it was greater than 12 inches in diameter. So what else did I have to work with in the stand? Unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot, because even though I had walnut on there, most of my walnut had cankers on them that were not going to turn into something valuable as for timber, but would still produce fruit for wildlife. So kind of that, you got to depend and try to balance what you're looking at. And a few bitternut hickory that have responded really well to the loss of ash, actually. When I look at it today, I've got more bitternut than I had prior. So if you want to stand in that bottom area of my woodland, you can kind of see the ash component was definitely the dominant component. And I knew that once they all went, afterwards was going to be a tough road to hoe. So in 2008, we did a small timber sale and removed some of the larger ash trees or saw timberized. I could try to get some of those smaller, because I had a lot of small, right on the edge, saw timber sized trees, and I wanted to move them up into a larger category so that we could think about harvesting them and getting some value out of them before they succumbed to emerald ash borer. And also, once we did that harvest, opened it up, that I went through and planted some other species, trying to put a little bit more diversity in that area, knowing that the elm was going to grow up and die, that the cankered walnut was not ideal, and really for the health of any future walnut, I needed to get them out, and cottonwood just kind of being cottonwood and not a great tree on a lot of respects, except that our cottonwood were on our stream bank, and so we left them because they were doing very well at holding the stream bank in place. So when it came to planting, you can look at this even today if you're thinking about trying to add some diversity. We looked at, I did some seed, so acorns and walnuts. These are sitting in a bin in a seed planter, but you can kind of mix and choose. Seed's an easy one to do here in the fall. You can pick them up and then put them in the ground. So it's kind of an easy one to do with usually decent returns when I look at what we tried to accomplish. I also did some small container species, nothing as big as you see here in the photo. Those I tried to plant in different areas where I could protect them from the deer and other critters that were running around in the woods. And then we also did some bare root seedlings. Of all of them, I have to say the bare root seedlings probably were the least successful, and maybe planting tool would have made a difference. We used dibble bars when we planted, and we made the lovely slit, but trying to close the slit completely with all the intertwined root systems in the forest soil was a little difficult, and we didn't have success on that one. So what did I plant? Well, you know, the list really is endless to what you could plant if you want to go in and try to plant some things. You can kind of see here my list. Some of them were just for fun. Had to throw some buckeyes in there. Threw some American chestnut that I got from a nursery. They aren't supposed to be, you know, resistant, but I thought let's try a few just to kind of see how they do. And you can kind of see this photo here I actually took earlier in the week. So they're doing fairly well, and they've put some great growth on. But the survival overall was so-so, as I said. I had raccoons that dug trees out of the ground, so the container trees were definitely attractive to them, and they would dig them out, and I could go down in the woods the next day and have to replant them. Eventually the raccoons won. But the seeds seemed to do well, and I already said kind of the bare root seedlings definitely was the worst one when we looked at survival. So along comes 2015. In this area, kind of see this area. You can see ash that are dead and very thin canopy. So I knew that at this point we were infested and we were starting to lose trees. And I just tried to monitor it and see where we were in the grand scheme of things. So this year, early January, had a timber sale. Mostly ash. And you can kind of see from the data here, we took out 679 trees, and 636 of those were ash. Heavy cut, heavier than probably you would like to do. But if you think about it, if we didn't take them, they were going to be standing dead. And so trying to maintain some use of the woods when you're dealing with such a heavy population, we took what was saleable. As you can kind of see here, here's a couple the consulting are marked for me that had already been dead when we marked the sale, and they looked like they were pretty punky, and the loggers didn't take them. And so unfortunately where they are, we're going to have to be very conscious of that standing tree and the potential to come down in any type of weather. Because one thing we know is that ash have a tendency to snap. So within probably 5 years, I'd say I've had some in that 4 to 5 year range that have just snapped. Not necessarily in windstorms. Sometimes you just hear them go. And so if you're planning to utilize your woods, this is a hazard that you don't want to have. And so as I'm thinking about my hunters that are going to be out there hunting, how can I reduce the risk of injury from some tree just snapping? And so that was kind of that other thought process as we took some of those ash out. Now, if you didn't harvest them and you've got them standing dead now in your woods, if they are not too far gone, and I will say I've had some very experienced guys who cut trees that have had some scary experiences trying to cut down dead ash, and so I don't really recommend it. But if they've just recently died, you might think about trying to put them on the ground before they find their way to the ground, if it's an area that you use. And that camping aspect that I put in there under the recreation up front, that's something that if you use your woodland for that kind of recreational activity, you want to be very conscious about these trees and where they are and where they may fall. So I can't stress enough that this is a safety issue, and you need to be very conscious of where they are and what stage they're in. So after the sale, you can kind of see here understory growth. This is just this year's growth because they just finished up the sale in March, but there's also some growth there from where we had dead canopies. So you're probably looking at maybe 2 years worth of growth in this particular area. So you start looking what's coming in. What do I have? Here's another way at it, and there's a lot of elm out through there. This is a lot of vegetation, not a lot of seedlings, though there are some ash seedlings in there, and you can kind of see in the overstory there's some cherry, there's more elm, and there's some sugar maple, and they're all starting to come into this area as I walk through and try to keep track of what's here and what's going to be here. So it really is time to do another inventory. It's time to take another gander down through there and what's coming up, what's filling those canopy gaps. Whether you harvested or whether you just have standing dead trees, you now have all this open area that something is going to move in and start growing in. So what do you have? And look at that what you have. You know, do you want to plant? Do you think you need to plant? Planting would be low on my priority list just because it really is tough to do. There are areas where I probably still will try to do some things, but it's not something I would spend a lot of time on. But all of this has to roll back to, what about your goals and objectives? What's here now? What's growing? Where do you go from here? How do you keep yourself on that path for your goals and objectives? You might look at picking crop trees, and I'll show you a fact sheet here in a minute on the crop tree, but it's really about picking trees that help you meet your goals and objectives. Wildlife trees, you know, things that produce mast, soft mast, hard mast, kind of relates back to what wildlife are you trying to manage for, you know, so what kind of tree species do you want to favor? Are you still thinking about timber? Then again, you kind of want to think about the species and what you're trying to accomplish. And for some folks, when you looked at that chart for why they own their woods and they talk about beautifying things, aesthetics. So flowering trees, trees that have gorgeous fall color, there's no reason why those can't be crop trees that you kind of favor and you work around and work with as you move ahead. You may want to release some. This goes back to what percentage was ash. So how much have you opened up the stand? You know, if you've got a stand like I have in some areas where 60% of that canopy is gone, then I'm not going to be cutting anything else down for quite a while. We need to get some canopy back in there and probably not looking to release a tree and give it more growing space because there's a lot of growing space there. You all want to make certain aren't opening it up too much so that you end up with trees that are susceptible to wind throw or some type of epicormic branching. So things to kind of think about as you walk through the woods and try to figure out what the results of the infestation are. Here's just a screenshot of our crop tree management. If you Google crop tree management, you'll find a lot of different states have fact sheets out there that can kind of walk you through the process, and it really is about giving the crown of the tree you've chosen to work with more room to grow. And it's a great tool for landowners because you can kind of pick that tree for whatever purpose you're trying to manage for, timber, wildlife, aesthetics, and then look up and try to give its crown more room to grow. And this kind of is a little more technical than I wanted to really dive into today, but I just wanted to put, as I said, think about a stand that was sections that were 60% ash. You know, I lost 60% of the canopy in those areas. So for foresters, we use stocking charts a lot when we're looking at these kind of things and when we're trying to help a landowner decide to thin or how heavy to thin or maybe not thin at all. And so in my case, that 60% loss takes me down to this understocked category in that area, which means you really don't want to do anything. You want to let it regrow and regenerate before you think about coming back in and removing trees and actively trying to manage, unless you're going to go in and try to plant. So we want our stands in that fully stocked range. Overstocked means, you know, we got too many trees to utilize the growing site. Fully stocked puts us kind of in the sweet spot. And that's always what we're trying to accomplish when we're working with forests. So when I look at my own stand, how many of these do I have? Unfortunately, I can honestly say too many of them. And so as I walked through the woods here earlier in the week, the buckthorn has really responded to the opening of the canopy, which is not a good thing. And so buckthorns kind of hopping to the top of my list of things that I'm going to have to manage. Get some goals probably with where they are and how they're located and try to get them out of here. Not as many autumn olive yet. I've got a lot of garlic mustard. I had it before, but the opening of the canopy has just seemed to make it explode. And honeysuckle for me is kind of on the low end of the number of species that I'm seeing. So if you look at this image, that's all winged euonymus or burning bush in that forest understory. And when you're dealing with an understory that is that solid with a non-native invasive plant, your regeneration becomes next to nothing, and so you have to deal with them. Unless you're willing to end up with a stand that is all of these non-natives and the larger trees above die out and you end up with a big patch of these non-native species or whatever else can compete with them. So we don't want them to dominate the site. We know that some of them can leave chemicals behind that inhibit growth of other species. We also know that some of them can change soil characteristics. So it's a good idea to be able to identify them early and work on them before they become something like you see in this image. When you've got a scattered plant here or there and you're walking through the woods, yank them out of the ground if you can. If they're a little more intense, like I have some patches of buckthorn, you know, then we'll go after them probably with a chemical application here this winter to try to knock them out. There's a lot of different fact sheets out here. Here are controlling undesirable trees, shrubs, vines in your wood sheet. Kind of goes over the basics of what your options are for practices to implement on trying to get rid of some of these species. It doesn't talk about foliar a lot because usually we aren't using foliar in a woodland scenario, but if the canopy was opened up enough that you've got patches where foliar will work, it is something to look at, but realize that foliar can also end up impacting some of those plants that you want for the future, that will help you accomplish your goals and objectives. Basil bark is another one. You're going to have some stems to work with. Smooth bark species, again, in the time, that are 12 to 18 inches, and we're going to spray something that's carried in an oil-based carrier to penetrate the bark. Cut stump is what a lot of folks like to use. They cut off the species and then either immediately treat if they're using a water-based, but if you're going to cut and then come back and treat with a chemical, then you want to use something like an oil-based. Always make certain that you implement the cut stump treatment when it's not frozen and the sap isn't running. A lot of landowners that are dealing with these kind of scenarios, if they've gotten so out of hand, like you see here on the right hand side where all of that green is bush honeysuckle, I have a lot of landowners that are going in and cutting those off, and then when they're just starting to resprout, go after them with a foliar application. You use a lot less chemical and you're better able to target and protect some of those species that want for the future versus, you know, maybe knocking them out of the stand when you go after all that honeysuckle. Squirt's another option, usually when we're dealing with trees, but if you're dealing with small stuff, it's not something that you're probably going to implement too much. We have a fact sheet on effectiveness of herbicides on different species. It's not exhaustive list, but it's kind of a targeted list. Facts in the process of being updated. Dave Krause and I have had a couple of conversations about getting this one done, but it can kind of give you an idea of what chemicals may work best on the species that you're seeing in your woodland. As we kind of reiterate, we talked about this up front, and for me the big one is be familiar with what your woodland looks like. What's there? What's going on? What kind of species diversity do you have? And is it going to keep you on track for those goals and objectives? All of that works very well, but we've got to be knowledgeable, a little more hands-on maybe than some of us have been in the past. And what's down the road? You know, what's your risk for something else that's out there? And so the nice thing is if you are familiar with your woodland and someone says to you, hey, you know, we found Asian longhorn beetle 3 counties over, you can kind of go through your inventory either in your head or however and say, wow, you know, so that one impacts these tree species, you know, maybe I need to adjust some management thoughts on different species. And so here in the images, the top one is Asian longhorn beetle. Thousand canker disease of black walnut is that center one with the very little tiny walnut twig beetles, and then on the bottom is spotted lanternfly. And so for Ohio, we've had both Asian longhorn beetle and thousand canker found in the state. Spotted lanternfly is in eastern Pennsylvania, so it's kind of good to know what's out there on the fringes. What's a potential thing that might be coming down the road? None of us have that perfect crystal ball that's going to tell us what pops up next. And keep an eye out for new invasive plants. You're walking through the woods, and the more you know your woodland, the more apt you are to say, whoa, that plant doesn't look right. And take a picture, send it to one of us. We're usually pretty good at trying to ID some things if we can and get you an answer, whether it's something you should worry about or not. So again, how familiar are you with your woodland as we move forward? So after Emerald Ash Borer, if you didn't before, get to know your woods. Understand what's out there, understand what's going on, and understand the big process here of what could be impacted depending on what comes down the pike next. So what do you have? What are the species? Are there any issues? Things that might be an issue in the future. Something to think about. What do you want? So that goes back to those goals and objectives, and you know what you have, you know what you want, you're trying to merge those two to create that path that keeps you on the straight and narrow, hopefully, working towards those goals and objectives. And how do you get there? What's the best process? There's no one great answer. Most of us foresters will laugh and say you could put 7 of us in the woods and you'd end up with 7 different management plans. So you are the driver in this. You know, what are those goals and objectives that you are trying to accomplish? The undesirables can be the non-native invasives, and it can also be undesirable species for your goals and objectives. So you need to keep that in mind. Get assistance. There's plenty of assistance out there. Not certain, you know, in each state it may be a little bit different, but there's professional foresters out there that are willing to help you accomplish what you're trying to on this piece of property you have invested in. And ask questions. I know when Asian longhorn beetle was found here in the state of Ohio, one of the things that came up was, you know, what if folks start reporting all these things and they're not Asian longhorn beetle? And one of my colleagues said, I'd rather have 100 negatives than to miss the one positive. And I think most of us feel that way. So if something doesn't look right, find something odd. I'd much rather have someone shoot me an email with a photo or questions to get the answers that you're looking for. So with that, hopefully, that kind of walks you down the path of some things to think about. There is no hard and fast rule in all of this. Everybody's going to have some different outlooks on what they have. Their property is going to dictate some things. So don't feel like you should be wrangled into what I walk through on our own property, but hopefully it kind of gives you a thought process of how to keep moving forward. Emerald ash borer wasn't the end of our woods, but it definitely created a challenge because prior to emerald ash borer for me, the ash were my future crop. And I wasn't thinking about ever losing them in that mix. So it caused us to look at our management plan and switch gears about things a little differently and do things that hadn't been on our radar, but we needed to do in order to keep the forest healthy and moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was excellent. And thank you all for attending. Do we have any questions? You can put them in the chat box or in the question and answer box. Okay, well, if no one has any questions, then I guess we can just wrap this up. Thank you again, Kathy. And please watch next week's webinar, the last webinar of this fall. Dr. Genzel of Purdue University is going to be talking about thousand cankers disease. Thank you.
Thanks.